Today we're taking a look at a video entitled The Transgender Paradox, or How to Fix the Transgender Issue. And if those titles make you think the creator's extremely transphobic, you're absolutely right.
With long hair, pre-teenagehood, and a close connection with stereotypical female pursuits such as horse riding, sewing, and cookery, I could have been confused as a pre-op transgender woman.
No, you would have been called a boy with long hair that liked horses. Implying a direct causation between gender-typical interests and being transgender is a logical fallacy because correlation does not imply causation. Many people, regardless of their gender identity, can have interests traditionally associated with the opposite gender without affecting their gender identity. This is a completely weird misconception people have about the transgender experience. Sure, some of us just experience the world from the get-go in the feminine, but many of us were just children, doing what children usually do. I was, for all intents and purposes, a fairly normal boy growing up. I watched He-Man, played a load of Nintendo, and did the normal boy roughhousing. But there was a side of me that would poke through every now and again, and my parents would catch me playing with my sister's toys, and my dad, in particular, would lecture me on how that was wrong. Occasionally, I would let out a girlish giggle, and my mom would tease me to the point of making me cry. At night, from about the ages of 5 or until I roughly hit puberty, I would literally pray to God that I would be turned into a girl. I guess what I'm trying to say is no, you wouldn't be mistaken for a pre-op transgender woman. At least, you shouldn't be.
Despite this and a confusing opposite gender nickname, I can't say I've experienced anywhere near the level of uncertainty many trans people feel when it comes to who they are and what makes them them.
Again, I think you have a serious case of a presupposition here. Transgender people already know who they were. There isn't some clouded confusion going on here. The presupposition that the modern world has caused people to question what their gender identity is isn't a logically sound one backed by modern science. This presupposition is rooted in homophobic propaganda, specifically targeted by the notion that the LGBTQ+ agenda has somehow caused innocent people to get confused about things. This entire notion is rooted in so-called conversion therapy that's so heavily promoted by extremist religious organizations. One of the first things you're taught in conversion therapy is that being gay, or in this case trans, isn't your fault and that you're just confused by left-wing democratic propaganda. This type of foundational assumption is what countries do to spies to torture information out of them. Telling someone they're just confused is torture. That's why your presupposition here is transphobic at its foundational level.
Because of this, I'm only an outsider in perspective. But I can see both sides of an argument without completely losing it, hope.
I've already demonstrated that you're coming from an inherently transphobic and thus anti-transgender position, so by default, you cannot see both sides of the argument.
Unfortunately, this has allowed me to see the issues raised by many regarding the safety of others, which have been highlighted many times throughout the years, but not really recognised by most people.
Maybe because people don't automatically assume that because a few transgender people commit crimes that the entire minority are criminals?
So let's see what I'm on about and if any of my solutions are liable to work. This is obviously a transgender argument, but first let's consider it, as you put, from the only religious angle that is applicable here. Note, I'm not referring to the Bible in Genesis saying that God made them man and woman.
Of course you're a Christian. Listen, I'm going to skip most of this biblical explanation here. I'm not a theological scholar. I'm a computer science major, and those two areas of philosophy rely on two completely different sets of argumentation.
Add that to the concept of hermaphroditism, which takes the binary sex of the body and returns the biscuits it apparently took, and we can't claim transgenderism isn't a thing.
First, I'll say this in every video I run across. Transgenderism is considered a slur by a large part of the transgender community. The etymology of transgenderism stems from transgender people being labeled as mentally ill. After nearly 100 years of trying to help transgender people, the American Psychological Association, along with the rest of the modern world, no longer recognizes being transgender as a mental illness because treating it like a mental illness empirically does not work. Instead, treating the underlying cause of being transgender, that is, gender dysphoria, does work. When we shifted from treating transgender people as having a mental illness to treating us like we have a physical ailment, our lives and survival statistics improved dramatically. I'd also like to point out that transgender is an adjective, not a noun. Now, as to your strange point about intersex people, what are you talking about? Hermaphroditism returns the biscuits it apparently took? Once again, you're using outdated terminology that generally considered to be stigmatizing, so we don't use it. Instead, we say intersex because, like the rest of everything you apparently have failed to understand, intersex people are far more complicated than just having their biscuits returned, whatever that means. Intersex people are born with or exhibit multiple sex characteristics, which may or may not include external genitals and secondary sex characteristics, along with a host of other things like chromosomes. After this, he goes on a long-winded rant about body modifications and what they may or may not mean philosophically in the Bible. I'm just going to skip this part because I have no interest in debating Christians on the Bible. But I'll say that being transgender isn't about body modifications. It's about being comfortable with who you are as a person and the role you fill in society. Sure, some body modifications may be part of a lot of transgender people's experience, but body modifications are an assist to helping people feel better about themselves, not an underlying goal.
This is the final step in gender reassignment and changing of sex. What about the part which I feel is the most important part of the transgender process?
Every transgender person has a different experience, but gender affirmation surgery isn't a penultimate goal. For some transgender people it is, but many transgender people elect to not undergo such surgeries because of the risks involved. The most important part of being transgender is not some reductivism about body modifications, but rather saving the life of the person who is transgender. That is the goal. Helping people live life to the fullest and letting them become the most capable person in a societal role is the goal of being transgender, not gender-affirming surgery. Sure, it's something that a lot of transgender people want as part of their transition, but it's not the goal of being a transgender person, and it's certainly not a requirement to be transgender. Heck, even taking hormones isn't required to be transgender. You just need to have gender dysphoria and are actively trying to rectify that. Additionally, there are transgender people who take hormones of the gender they most closely associate with, but choose not to socially transition. So no, surgery is not the most important part of being transgender. Not at all.
The gender fluid, gender identity stage is important, and is the point that could cause a lot of contention.
Transitioning from one gender to another is a process, to be certain, but there is no transgender process that includes various stages. Although some people do consider themselves to be gender fluid, there is no transgender stage of fluidity per se.
I've heard people wanting to transition from one sex, and then want to transition back to the first, and then back to the second again. All of which doesn't really help the credibility of trans rights.
What he's referencing here are people who detransition and then, I'm assuming, retransition. The statistics behind which are interesting but nascent, and the reasons for detransitioning seem to indicate that most people detransition because of family and social pressures, not because of some kind of internal regret for undertaking the process. With that being said, how does the existence of people who detransition undermine the credibility of trans rights? These people need trans rights protections just as much, if not more, than regular transgender people. You're talking about a vulnerable population of people who not only had to endure the social stigma of being transgender, but then also endure the stigma of detransitioning. Additionally, so many more questions begin to emerge, including things such as, should they medically be allowed to detransition? For many transgender women, they become incapable of producing testosterone on their own, either through the influence of hormones or surgery, and so would need even more gender-affirming care in the form of highly regulated and controlled testosterone. Additionally, if they currently pass as feminine, which bathroom should they use? Trans rights aren't undermined by the existence of people who detransition. Rather, the importance of trans rights is emphasized.
It isn't a stage to breeze through lightly, and should, in all seriousness, be taken as a time of reflection, self-exploration, and maybe therapy. I would like to clarify, I don't mean therapy to discourage it, but to fully understand what one is feeling before they choose to take the next step and become their genuine sex.
Everything you've just described is exactly what transgender people go through. You don't just wake up one morning and decide that you're transgender. It's a lifelong struggle to understand who you are, why you act the way you act, why you like the things you shouldn't like, etc. You literally spend a lifetime asking yourself the same questions. Am I transgender? Should I transition? Would I be happier as a man or a woman? What is life like as a man or a woman? We spend countless hours in therapy discussing how we feel, why we feel it, often justifying our own feelings to therapists who would rather use outdated terminology and highly contested unscientific answers to guide us away from being transgender. But at the end of the day, the question still bothers us, the desire still lingers, and no matter what we do, that seed of discontent remains planted. For many of us, we end up in forced therapy situations because we try to take our own lives. According to statistics, 41% of transgender people report having attempted suicide in the past. You're already assuming we haven't spent a literal lifetime reflecting on how we feel and discussing it with therapists. Yes, we have. I'm not even going to address the changing sex line. Sex is a biological definition that involves chromosomes, and the word transgender literally has the word gender in it, so I think that part speaks for itself.
Societal norms get in the way, and common conveniences become a point of contention. In watching videos by Lex Mayer of Unlearn the Lies, I found his argument against transgenderism is more out of concern of the safety of women and girls. If a man claims to identify as a woman, only to take advantage of it, enter a woman's bathroom for the purpose of perving or even assaulting women and girls in what is meant to be a safe haven.
Oh, so the bathroom debate. Right. There are so many logical points of contention I have with this debate, the primary one being that just because a small minority of people may commit crimes is not a good reason to oppress an entire minority. After all, the vast majority of sexual crimes committed against girls and women, at least in the United States, are straight, white, heterosexual men. Importantly, you'll note that transgender isn't anywhere in that classification. So, your hypothetical of a man dressing up as a woman and claiming to be transgender just so he can attack girls and women when they're very vulnerable doesn't make any logical sense. Because those men that are attacking women are, get this, already attacking women. Giving transgender women the opportunity to poop in a specific gendered bathroom isn't going to change that and isn't opening up some magical floodgates of sexual assault against women because, and I hate to be the one to break this to you, those floodgates are already open. Women are already getting sexually assaulted at an absurdly high rate in this country. Allowing transgender women into different bathrooms isn't going to change that. It also isn't going to stop criminal psychopaths. And let's be clear here, your hypothetical is something that is only going to be committed by someone with some kind of psychopathy. These people have likely already attempted to pass as women and assault women. And why does this discussion start and stop in bathrooms? There are some other women-exclusive spaces that psychopaths could intentionally infiltrate to assault women, so why is this debate always centered around the bathroom? I'll tell you why. And this is going to sound disgusting, but you're going to have to hear it out. It's because defecation is an essential part of life. Everything living does it, and denying people the ability to defecate in a way they are comfortable with is essentially denying them not only their humanity, but their right to life.
You may think it sounds far-fetched, but it's not as far out there as we might hope, since criminals of all kinds have transgressed boundaries in this manner since before records began, using whatever loopholes is open to them.
Yeah, but those loopholes are already there. Transgender women have been using these female safe spaces for 100 years, and it wasn't a problem until right-wing fascists made it a hot-button problem. That means criminal psychopaths have already had this opportunity for the last 100 years at least. You aren't preventing anything, and you aren't fixing anything either.
Unfortunately, we can't even say it's only hypothetical, since a recent case here in Scotland has made the headlines and caused ripples in the LGBT plus circles of Holyrood.
I'm not 100% sure on what story he's discussing, but the closest thing I can find is a story from 2019 about 18-year-old transgender woman named Katie Dolotowski, who committed a string of sexual assaults against children in public bathrooms, even going so far as to threaten them and their parents with knives if they tried to escape. I could be wrong, so apologies if I am, but let's address this story anyway because it's horrific. So here's the thing. Just because one transgender person was a complete psychopath, it does not follow that all transgender people are psychopaths. Yes, while what Miss Dolotowski did was abhorrent, and I disagree with the judge's decision to not put her in prison, her actions don't speak for the whole of the transgender or even LGBTQ plus community. She's one person. This is like being scared of all black people because one black guy committed a crime somewhere, or being afraid of Italian Americans because some Italian Americans are member of a criminal syndicate. None of us are saying that crime doesn't happen. Crime is going to happen. It's part of living in a society. There are statistics we can track and see where real correlations are. And, newsflash, it's not transgender people. We're not saying that crimes like this should be ignored. They should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. What we're saying is that the horrific actions of one person should not be used to judge a group as a whole, and instead, the underlying causes for such actions need to be addressed. And being transgender is not an underlying cause.
There are many more that have cropped up throughout the years.
Do you want to cite an example? Give some statistics? Maybe show that transgender people, according to whoismakingnews.com, account for 0.0574% of sexual crimes against children, while pastors account for over 5%? Or that transgender people, both men and women, are 4 times more likely to be the victim of a sexual assault than any cisgendered person? Or that transgender people are nearly 40 times more likely to attempt suicide than the general population as a whole? Given the atrocious number of crimes committed against women and children every day, just because a few individual cases crop up throughout the years doesn't mean that there's some sort of epidemic happening.
For those of you who aren't aware, a man by the name of Adam Graham was convicted of raping 2 women in Scotland. But at some point in the time between committing the crime and sentenced for that crime, he started identifying as female and went by the name of Isla Branson. This led to a massive hoo-ha amongst the trans rights campaigners and the Scottish criminal system and courts. Some of the criminals were committed by a man and convicted, and the convict was arrested and charged as a man, and so should be put in a prison for men. However, trans rights activists say she identifies as a woman and so should be remanded in a female prison. This raises concerns over the safety of women in prisons, and many of whom have already faced abuse and trauma at the hands of men.
Alright, so lock her up with the women, and if she gets out of line, do what you do with every other prisoner and isolate them. I mean, you're trying to prevent hypothetical crimes here. Sure, the woman in question has committed sexual crimes in the past, and the recidivism rate among that group is incredibly high. But you're talking about prison here, a secure location where people are kept under constant supervision. Yes, crimes happen in prison, but do you know what else happens in prison? Gangs. People form in-groups and protect each other because prison is a terrible environment, and as a side note, needs some serious reformation. Do you know what else prisoners do? They work out. A lot. When you have nothing else to do besides walk in a circle in the prison yard all day and read books, the other thing you tend to do to occupy your time is exercise. You're coming at this from the strange perspective that women in prison are completely helpless. They're not. This, I will admit, suspiciously transgender woman getting sent to a woman's prison isn't going to be a problem for them in the long term. She might commit sexual assault while she's in there, but the likelihood of that happening is low, and if it does happen, you can bet she's going to face some serious repercussions, and not just from the legal system. All of this just to say there is no reason to repress an entire minority of people because one person might hypothetically commit a crime.
If they are in recovery or therapy from it, a well-known rapist entering their sanctum, could put them back some way. This is not a new thing, and in fact has happened before, as one person has not only raped women outside of prison, but has transitioned whilst in prison, while still holding the male genitalia, and entered a female facility, was transitioned to a female facility and further abused women.
Again, the key phrase here is one person. One person out of how many exactly? And how often does this abuse happen? Are they on hormone replacement therapy? Have they received gender-affirming care? Does the prison system they're in even offer hormone treatment for transgender prisoners, or do they force prisoners to medically detransition? There are so many unanswered questions to your unsourced claim that it's impossible to defend against, and yet the logic behind it is still flawed. It's one person in one prison. As of 2022, the U.S. prison population, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, was 1.23 million people. If 1% of that population is transgender, that means there's about 12,300 transgender prisoners. Of those, one person committed this crime. That's 0.00813% of the transgender prison population. If 10 transgender prisoners commit a similar crime, that's 0.0813% of the transgender prisoner population. If 100 transgender prisoners commit this crime, that's 0.813% of the population. And I can't find 100 confirmed stories of transgender women committing crimes against other prisoners over the last decade, let alone every single year. So the next bit has some more rambly stuff that doesn't really have a point or really talk about transgender people at all, so we're just going to skip it and move ahead.
Since statistics show that transgender crimes, both male and female, are a minority, this implies there isn't any need to shift it and merely have an exception to the general rule. I'm sure some people in any trans camp will say this is a classic example of what can happen and will happen again. Having an argument with someone about abortion of rape victims, for rape victims, and pointing out that it's rare for that to be the case, is to say the exception, not the rule, and shouldn't change the rules at all. Would seem appropriate, but this highlights the dangers of the 1%. So regardless of our feelings on the subject, we should be aware of the dangers it presents.
I'm sorry for letting that run as long as I did, but his rambling, incoherent thoughts have been tough to dissect. What I think he's saying is essentially the notion that the 1% exists and is claiming it's a real danger. First, he gets his numbers extremely wrong. There are no statistics that indicate that transgender people are responsible for 1% of any sort of criminal statistic. There isn't even any individual statistical data that I'm aware of that implicates 1% of transgender people of being guilty of any sort of crime. Whether he's using the 1% as a colloquialism or not is irrelevant. That number is blown way out of proportion and is, in and of itself, a transphobic statement. He's also presenting the false premise that allowing transgender people into women's spaces presents a clear and present danger to women. But the last 100 years of transgender people being allowed to exist shows that this is empirically wrong. Look, his whole argument here boils down to a presupposition that transgender people represent a real danger to women, even if it's on a small scale, and has written his argument from this point of view without ever doing the honest research to see if this is a true statement or not, and just tried to write a piece of emotionally compelling gibberish to trash transgender people.
That this violation of a female refuge is similar to trans athletes competing in women's sports.
Wait, hold on. Did you just refer to a women's prison as a refuge? I know the term safe space gets thrown around a lot by the LGBTQ+ community, but I think calling all women's prisons a refuge is a bit of a stretch. Unless we've shifted topics again and you're just referencing all women-only spaces as a refuge. Also, what do you folks want to bet that he doesn't mention the medical effects of hormone therapy has on transgender women, or even mentions trans men at all?
In some ways, yes. And I will cover that. But the main issue is that a former male competing in a female sports category is going to have a natural advantage, especially if they are either pre-op or transitioning after they developed under the influence of male hormones.
This guy, like so many other people, has this misnomer in his head about what gender-affirming surgery is all about. Being pre-op, which incidentally is a term I hate because not all transgender people aspire to get surgery, isn't something that is going to give you a natural physical advantage over women. Testosterone is. Well, not entirely testosterone, but by and large, it's testosterone that'll allow you to develop a bigger skeleton, larger muscles, and secondary masculine traits. Your genitals don't really have anything to do with that other than producing your hormones. But here's the caveat. Taking hormones, especially estrogen, naturally suppresses other hormones in the body. Many transgender women, myself included, in addition to taking estrogen, also take a testosterone suppressant, such as spirulactone. We not only are attempting to match the estrogen levels of a natal cisgender woman, we're also trying to match her testosterone levels as well. The effects of hormone replacement therapy are slow and subtle, but for a transgender woman, that usually includes a severe reduction in libido, shrinking of the ligaments, and a massive reduction in muscle mass. And I mean massive. While you can still develop muscles, they're not on the same level as that of a man, and they end up being on the same level as that of a cisgendered woman. And I mean massive. While you can still develop muscles, they're on the same level as that of a cisgendered woman. Now, that isn't to say that I necessarily agree that anyone should be able to declare themselves to be transgender just to take part in women's sports immediately. I think there is something to be said for having a verifiable medical transition history and competing in women's sports. I mean, I'm not denying that Mitchell Hooper, currently crowned the world's strongest man, doesn't have a natural strength advantage over Rebecca Roberts, the currently crowned world's strongest woman. And if either of those two top competitors wants to transition, especially in Mitchell's case, I'd want to see them go through a medical transition first before they were allowed to compete within their gendered category. But this brings me to a much larger problem that's been eating at me in the back of my mind. I feel like these complaints about transgender women aren't rooted in concern for women and their safe spaces. Rather, I feel like there's an undertone of racism here. What I mean is, many of the examples that people like to give when it comes to transgender women competing in women's sports are the so-called natural advantages that men allegedly have over women in competitive sports, such as physical size, more muscle mass, longer and more flexible ligaments, longer wingspan, etc. The problem is, when compared to the majority white population of this country, do you know who else fits these complaints? Who else has a larger overall physical size, is generally capable of greater muscle mass naturally, has longer and more flexible ligaments, much longer wingspans, etc.? Black athletes. So while white people have these discussions on what is a woman and who can play in women's sports, it seems awfully suspicious to me that a lot of the complaints levied against transgender women just happen to coincide with the physical traits of black female athletes as well. Of course, I don't have any data to back this up. It just seems suspicious to me.
This would be analogous to competing or training under the influence of performance or development enhancing drugs, which are already illegal in every sporting event, regardless of the category of gender, mass, or ability.
Right, so transgender men are excluded from all competitions then because the hormones they must take are strictly banned by most competitive sporting associations worldwide?
If a woman had taken drugs to enhance their prowess, they would be banned from that sport, since it's changing their bodies to improve their chances unfairly. So how is this any different?
It's a lot different. While the rhetoric for getting performance-enhancing drugs banned is because of competitive fairness, the reason we want these drugs banned from sports is because they set a bad precedent for the spectator. These drugs carry serious risks, as we've seen from an entire generation of professional wrestlers dying at extremely young ages due to heart failure, likely caused by years of steroid abuse. What we don't want to see are the side effects of these drugs, especially as little kids and teenagers attempt to emulate their heroes. The last thing any professional association wants is to relate to a massive number of deaths because they peddled a bunch of life-shortening drugs. That's the real reason we ban performance-enhancing drugs. Sure, you can argue that the purity of the sport is at risk, but let's be realistic. Tommy John surgery exists, and pitchers who get it often end up performing better over the long term than pitchers that don't. Yet Tommy John surgery is a medically necessary procedure in certain injuries. Does that infringe on the so-called purity of the sport? Would a robotic prosthetic limb that performs as well as, not even better than, just as well as a human limb be seen as infringing on the purity of the sport? I mean, after all, the robotic limb wouldn't get tired like a normal limb would. These are complex philosophical questions that we have to ask ourselves as technology continues to improve and advance. How is this any different from transgender people competing in their identified gendered sports category? Well, the transgender athletes aren't changing their bodies to improve their chances unfairly. They're changing their bodies to help ease their dysphoria. Competing in sports isn't an important part of this conversation at all, unlike when you take performance-enhancing drugs, whose primary purpose is to enhance capability. But I've already gone over why transgender athletes don't have this imaginary advantage you seem to think they have, so let's move on.
Going back to the issue of safety, formerly beloved author J.K. Rowling was slammed on social media when she aired her transgender views. But it's worthwhile noting that it's not dissimilar to how atheists raised in an uncompromising fundamentalist household or community respond to religion, or people raised in druggy or alcoholic homes respond to those substances.
I don't have a response to this. None of this follows. J.K. Rowling's completely insane and transphobic comments are similar to how atheists respond to religion and drug users respond to drugs? I don't really get the analogy you're going for here. Are you trying to say that J.K. Rowling is taking a more intellectual approach to the topic of transgender people? Like how atheists take an intellectual approach to the topic of God? I mean, if that's the case, then you're wrong. Completely and utterly wrong. Transgender people are far more like atheists than J.K. Rowling is in this regard. There's a small mountain of growing evidence that shows that not only is gender dysphoria a real problem for people, but transitioning to a gender that more closely aligns with your own internal view of yourself helps people tremendously. This is the exact opposite of the position J.K. Rowling has taken, which essentially amounts to feels before reals. If anything, transgender people are the atheists, and J.K. Rowling is the god they see no evidence for existing. But J.K. Rowling does exist, and transphobia and transgender discrimination are a very real problem in the world.
Rowling was a victim of domestic abuse and sexual assault, which she had no support for in her area. This has led to her solid views on trans women entering the safe space created for cis women in that situation.
So, I'm not here to debate a straw man argument over J.K. Rowling's views on transgender people. I'm just going to say that the logic he's trying to imply here is flawed and is based on the presupposition that transgender women commit sex crimes at a higher rate and present an equal or greater danger to women than cisgender men or even other cisgendered women. It's a stupid argument, and I've spent the last 8 pages of this script providing evidence as to why that's a faulty premise in the first place.
She is making a point that is being ignored by those focusing on gaining the rights of those trying to fit into the world that is just not welcoming to them.
I have disappointing news for you. The vast majority of people seem to be very welcoming and accepting of transgender people, especially those in the related medical and mental health fields. According to the Gender Policy Report, an astonishing 82.9% of American respondents in August 2022 said that transgender people deserve the same rights and protections as other Americans, and 82.7% of people said that laws should protect transgender children from bullying in school. When you say the world is just not welcoming to them, what you really mean is that your world is not welcoming to them. Your small, hate-filled minority viewpoint of the world doesn't like transgender people. The rest of the world just wants exactly what transgender people want, to live happy lives. That's it.
So is there a solution to this? I think there is, but it's not going to please the trans rights activists, my sister-in-law being one of them, so I'm sorry about that. Whilst one of the many arguments within the LGBT plus community to justify their existence is that you can't judge the gender of a person by their genitals. Unfortunately, there's the best deciding factor for this highly controversial debate. If you trained and developed with a stud tackle, you jockey up with the men.
And that's it. This whole video ends abruptly and was a 16-minute long wind-up to say that if you have a penis, you're a boy, and if you have a vagina, you're a girl. Well, okay then, if that's your opinion, then I guess that's your opinion, but it's a bad one, and your transphobic points aren't rooted in any real scientific evidence or have any basis for that matter. I know this video comes across as me punching down on someone with maybe a less well-developed sense of the arguments being presented, but this video is very representative of the kinds of arguments we see being flung at the transgender community constantly. It's nothing but a whole lot of special pleading and whataboutism. Well, that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching through. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel to see more of it. If you didn't like it, please dislike it and leave a comment. Let me know what you didn't like about it. I would certainly love to engage in an intellectual discussion about what we discussed in this video. Until then, we'll see you next time. Bye.